Stephanie Baker is a senior writer at Bloomberg covering the intersection of business and politics. She has also written for the Moscow Times and Radio Free Europe. Stephanie is author of a fantastic book, Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. And of course, we will put links to that book and where you can buy it and read it in the description of this video. The book tells the story of how a furious financial war unfolded following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, from seizing super yachts to manipulating the global price of oil to blocking the sale of military technology in a series of unprecedented sanctions that have radically rearranged global alliances. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any of the incredible speakers that give up their time to appear on the channel. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities as well. It's extraordinarily important at this time to help Ukraine remain resilient in the face of extraordinary aggression by Russia, and now they've been joined by North Korea as well. I also want to say thank you to all of the loyal audience, especially those who have bought me a coffee or become a patron of the channel. It's incredibly important at this time to help support the work that we're doing as we expand the activities of Silicon Curtain and other efforts to fight Russian disinformation and propaganda. Stephanie, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to be delighted to actually meet you in person later this week. You're doing an event around the book. I'll put a description on that in the video here. But you have you've been doing a lot of these interviews. Hopefully, we'll find an angle here that hasn't necessarily been covered, but it's going to be quite tricky given how extraordinarily active you've been in the global media, trying to shine a spotlight on this. Could you give us a quick summary, though, of the front lines of the economic war between Russia and those countries that form part of the so-called rules-based order?
Right. So after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, the U.S., working together with Europe, the U.K., and the Group of Seven most industrialized nations, rolled out a series of unprecedented sanctions against Russia. And I liken this to an experiment, really, because never before had a coalition as large as that come together to impose sanctions on a country and an economy as big as Russia and as integrated into the global financial system. So they did everything from freeze a pot of $300 billion roughly of Russia's central bank reserves that was parked in the West, probably one of its most consequential actions, which it took within days of Russia's full-scale invasion. And then it rolled out a series of sanctions on Russian banks, kicking many Russian banks out of the global financial system, and specifically out of SWIFT, this Gmail of the banking system. It's kind of a messaging platform for banks to transmit payments globally. And then eventually, by the end of 2022, they imposed this novel, wonky policy called the price cap on Russian oil, in an attempt to drive down Putin's oil revenues, which had shot up as a result of his invasion and panic over Russian supplies. So they moved across the board. I don't think they moved hard enough or fast enough, and we can talk about that as we go on. But I have been trying to fight this notion that sanctions aren't working, why bother? And it's been a relentless refrain that I've heard from various people as I tell them, as I told them I was writing a book on this. And I just realized that this is essentially a page out of Putin's propaganda book. He wants everyone to think the sanctions aren't working, that they're costing the West more than they're costing Russia. In reality, Russia has hidden a lot of economic data. It's often hard to get a real sense of how bad the Russian economy is at right now. There are a lot of things we can look at, and I do think that the sanctions have had more of an impact than they're given credit for. Clearly, they have not successfully deterred Russia or driven Russian troops out of Ukraine, but that does not necessarily mean they're not working. They've cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. And I do think that the pressures on the Russian economy from those sanctions are really beginning to mount. And we see that with slowing economic growth, persistent inflation, really high interest rates. And I think that 2025 is going to be a difficult year for Putin.
And really, the book focuses on many of these measures that are put in place at the start of the full-scale war. Is that the beginning of the economic war essentially against Russia, or you could flip it, Russia's economic war against the world, because of course Russian aggression, there are certain sort of key timelines there. 2008 invasion of Georgia, 2014 invasion of Crimea, and then Donbass. And from the perspective of people like, I think, yourself, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, Timothy Ash, and others, they'd make the case that sanctions weren't nearly strong enough or punitive enough 2014 and provided no deterrence to Russia. Whereas on the other side, even some so-called Russian liberals would say that within Putin's circle, it was felt that sanctions were an inevitability. Therefore, whatever we do, we're going to be sanctioned. So let's do whatever we will. And of course, they have since then. How far is there this gulf of miscommunication, or even sort of poor projection of these sanctions in terms of sort of deterrence, and this interpretation, which seems to be quite common in Moscow, that we were already engaged in economic war with Russia prior to the full-scale invasion?
Right. So in the book, I do go back into history, and partly because I got my start as a young reporter in Moscow in the 1990s, covering the economy and privatization and the economic transition. And part of what I wanted to look at is, how did we get here? Did the West really step up enough in the 1990s when Russia really needed help for the transition? I argue that they didn't, and that the lack of Western assistance at the scale of what Russia really needed after the collapse of the Soviet Union created the ground for a leader like Putin to come to power. And I go into the history of the sanctions, both the lack of a response to Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia, in the Bush administration, and there were no economic sanctions against Russia in response to that. I go back to 2014. I have a whole chapter going back, looking at what happened in U.S. policy after Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Donbass operation, and talk to various policymakers and try to tell it from their perspective, like why was the response not strong enough? Because I really wanted to understand, what were they thinking? That this was the first, rather the second major, violation of the UN Charter by Russia. Why wasn't the response more hard hitting? And various figures there told me that there was a reluctance in Europe to really go after Russia, and that was a self-limiting factor for the U.S. response, because Obama didn't want to get ahead of where Europe was. Obama was the president who wanted to end wars. He did not want to engage with this. Europe was coming out of a debt crisis, and I think even the U.S. economy was still a bit soft coming out of the financial crisis. So there just really wasn't an appetite to go after Russia in a really hard-hitting way. But it was a time when there was a lot of experimentation going on about how do you attack a major economy without it having blowback on the West, on the US economy. And they developed these targeted pinprick sanctions that really were meant to gum up the financial plumbing of major Russian companies without having any disruptive effect in Europe or in the United States. Now, I think that those targeted sanctions did have some effect, combined with falling oil prices, but they weren't in any way expansive enough to really change Putin's calculus. And I think that was a lesson that even people involved in that debate at the time acknowledge.
And a key part of some of those sanctions, and one of the more successful parts, of course, is the Magnitsky Act, which were championed by Bill Browder. And he's been on the channel. If people don't know that story, it's an extraordinary story. They can go back and watch that episode. He's done a lot of interviews about that. But this also perhaps is a misreading of Russia and its system, targeting rich, influential individuals within the regime. Certainly, that makes them feel a certain amount of pain, or maybe it doesn't, or it's an inconvenience perhaps to them. But it's also built on the idea that somehow they're going to have the broader interests of their country and their population at mind. And they're going to think, okay, well, hang on a second, I'm being sanctioned, and maybe, we don't want this to extend it to the whole population. Maybe we should change our behaviors. That, of course, hasn't worked. And it's also perhaps clear now that the elites really don't care about the economic and financial pain of the broad population. Has that dictated the kind of sanctions we're seeing now, which are far broader and essentially they encompass the entire Russian population, not just little pockets of the so-called elite?
Right. So I think they really did go after an expanded list of Russian billionaires, uh, government officials around Putin that were involved in the war. And there's no doubt that they are very unhappy with the situation. These Russian so-called oligarchs, the tycoons that control huge swathes of the Russian economy, have had their assets in the West frozen and their lifestyle completely disrupted. So let's be clear, this is not having no effect. They're very annoyed with this. They've had billions of dollars frozen in the West. But it does pose one of the most perplexing challenges of the sanctions regime. How do you sanction a mafia state? How do you use sanctions to undermine the power and control of a mafia state like Russia is right now? Because a lot of those figures around Putin made their money off of Putin. So they're not going to turn on him, because if they turn on him, their fortunes may be put into question. There are other tycoons who operate in fear of having those assets seized. So they have largely fallen in line with their assets in the West frozen. I think that the sanctions against those figures are perfectly valid because they are part of the DNA of Putin's Russia. They control huge swathes of the Russian economy. And at this point, given the economy on a full war footing, almost full, now you can argue that they could go further, that all these tycoons have businesses that are directly or indirectly feeding into the war economy, either through taxation or through actual military supplies and resources. So it's a real problem, actually. I think how do you either destroy the oligarchy without enriching Putin himself further and giving him more power, uh, and how do you use some of the more Western-facing members of the Russian elite and get them on side? That hasn't happened so far, and I think uh, there's a real debate as to whether or not it's possible to even do that, to bring them on side. I think the whole system is rotten to the core, and it needs to be attacked from a very broad-based position.
That certainly sort of chimes with many of the interviews on this channel. But there also seems to be this sort of persistent current, both in the media and maybe it's influenced, as you mentioned, by Russian propaganda, that is the underplaying of the impact of sanctions in curtailing Putin's war machine and indeed in ending the war itself. Much of the coverage and especially in parts of, let's say, the mainstream media, but also the broader social media space, it focuses on the incremental losses of territory by Ukraine. It focuses on often the negative and the attritional impact of the war, not so much on looking at the impact on Putin's economy. But there are some diaspora commentators who really do focus on this. I'm thinking in particular of Vladimir Milov, Michael Naki, and others. And they point out that actually Putin's war economy is something of a facade. It is not the sort of economic miracle that propaganda would have us believe, and it could be extraordinarily brittle. Are we underplaying that? Are we perhaps not pushing the sanctions lever hard enough to try and bring the war to an end?
Oh, I think we certainly could be pushing the sanctions much harder to try to bring, Russia's defense industry to its knees. I think there's a lot that could have been done earlier. And you read these Treasury announcements that come out this from the U.S. Treasury, and new sanctions that are being rolled out constantly. And just recently, I thought, defense industries that were and enterprises that were sanctioned just recently, you think, why on earth, 2.5 years after this full-scale invasion, are we still sanctioning Russian defense factories? And part of me believes that the US government, as well as UK and European governments, didn't have a handle on what was happening in Russia. They didn't understand the Russian defense industry well enough. And I think that's been one of the big lessons of this war, both in terms of all the missiles and drones and the tanks, et cetera, that have been recovered on the Ukrainian battlefield has been a major eye opener. We've gotten a peek inside Russian weaponry. What do they need in order to continue producing? But let's face it, Russia would not be turning to North Korea for artillery and for missiles, or Iran for missiles and drones, if it was able to do all of this on its own. There's clearly pressure on the Russian defense industry to keep up with the pace of the attacks that Putin is launching against Ukraine. Russia has burned through a lot of its Soviet-era stockpiles of weaponry. And when I was in Ukraine in June, there was, I did a whole story, a deep dive on a Russian missile attack, and it was clear from the Ukrainian intelligence officials that I spoke to that the missiles that are being fired on Ukraine now are fresh. These are not old missiles. The Russian defense industry and enterprises, they're working on a 24/7 basis. And I do think that they're reaching peak capacity. They're facing bottlenecks of components that they need. The U.S. has stepped up some of the efforts, and I go into this in the book, how the U.S. is trying to impose these trade restrictions to deny Russia access to Western technology, specifically semiconductors, microelectronics that it needs for its precision-guided weaponry. And they have imposed a series of, export controls that are very much bringing the U.S. towards Cold War footing. But I think what they didn't do early enough, and they've only done this in the past sort of 9 months or so, is threaten secondary sanctions to try to enforce that. In other words, they threatened in December that they would impose sanctions on foreign banks that were doing business with Russia's defense industrial complex, and then it widened that threat in June to try to shut down that trade by focusing on the financial flows behind it rather than customs officials. Now, that has had some effect, and you see that in Russia now, that the price of borrowing in Chinese yuan has shot up. There is a mini payments crisis happening in Russia. So I do wonder if that had only been threatened in 2022, where would we be at? Because just the threat of it has had an impact. What would happen if they actually took the next step and actually impose sanctions on a Chinese bank? Because so far what they've done, and I document this through some fascinating stories in my book, they've gone after these middlemen, a couple of whom were caught in the United States dealing with a Russian intelligence officer in Estonia, shipping technology to the Russian defense industry. They've tried to shut down these middlemen, but that I think is only going to get you so far. That's like a whack-a-mole strategy, which has its limits, and it's capped by the amount of resources that the Justice Department has.
And it sounds from what you say that we don't have sufficient intelligence on the structure of the Russian defense industry, let alone this gray zone of middlemen, arms procurement people, and the sort of the leaky sieve. I mean, Russia has vast borders. And the exports of, let's say, European manufactured goods, even defense components, machine tools, and so on, have spiked in many countries that border Russia, even those that have their own sort of disputes and issues with Russia. It seems, and I may be wrong here, it seems that either we do not know enough about how this is taking place, or there's no real appetite to comprehensively block the pores of this leaky sieve that enables Russia to get the materials and components that it needs to keep on delivering weapons of death into Ukraine.
Well, I think part of it is that the sanctions coalition isn't broad enough. And what you've seen, and I've documented in the book, is US officials and European officials traveling to places like Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, Dubai, warning them that they really need to be following US sanctions, or their financial institutions and companies could be subjected to US sanctions themselves. Now, this is a pretty delicate game for them. They have to tread lightly so that it's not seen as US lecturing them, but that trying to get them on side. And I think that's been part of the problem, is that there needs to be some incentives for countries on Russia's border to be adhering to those US sanctions rather than just a sort of slap on the wrist, you really shouldn't be doing this. Let's face it, most of the stuff that Russia has been getting has been going via China, Hong Kong, and India, as well as places like Turkey, which is a NATO member, and the UAE, which has extensive intelligence cooperation agreements with the United States. And I think the greatest lever that the U.S. has is on places like Turkey as a NATO member, but there's still lots going on. That's a vast kind of open hole, I think, in the sanctions regime. As well as Dubai. But I think that there needs to be a kind of argument made to some of these countries why it's in their interest to be following the US sanction regime, and perhaps some carrots dangled to entice them to follow them.
This is carrot and a stick kind of operation. On the one hand, play ball and you'll get good things. On the other hand, you may risk secondary sanctions, which could suck in a lot of institutions into that. And this seems to have had an effect on certainly China. Now, there are still reports that military components, etc., are making their way, and various equipment as well, uniforms, night sights. There are the various sort of, rumors of a whole different set of classes of equipment. But it does seem that the financial instruments that are put in place, these sort of credit agreements, both domestic and sort of commercial state level ones, have started sort of drying up, that China is no longer either willing to expose its financial system to Russia. Either one could assume fear of perhaps not being compensated for that, but maybe the greater fear is of secondary sanctions from the US, because of course Russia is a tiny, almost a rounding error when it comes to the amount of imports or exports rather that China has around the world. It has a much bigger trading relationship with the US, Europe, and so on. Is this a lever that we could push harder? And what are the mechanics of making sure secondary sanctions are effective, especially against China?
Right. So I think the US has been very reluctant to use secondary sanctions on China and sanction a Chinese bank, because already relations with Beijing are a bit frosty, and they want to keep an open channel of communication and not have the relationship further worsen. Washington did impose sanctions on a Chinese bank for violating Iran sanctions. We haven't seen that yet with Russia, but we may do so depending on the outcome of the US election. I think that they could use it as a lever. And as you say, if you look at a bar chart of China's exports to the world, Russia is a tiny sliver. It needs access, and it needs to have its financial system have access to the US dollar to continue this huge volume of trade with the world. And it's particularly with the United States. So it's not worth it for Russia, for China to do this business with Russia. It's just in pure economic terms. But of course, Beijing is playing this game with Moscow, as well as Iran, to create this coalition against this US-led economic order. So it's trying to sort of play both sides. But I do think that the sanctions could be used to drive a wedge between China and Russia, forcing them to choose sides. And that is what Washington has done with a number of other countries. Like, either you do business with Europe and the US, or you do business with Russia. Take your pick. The amount of trade with Russia, despite it being a large country, is relatively small. And I think most of those countries would choose to do business with the rest of the world and not be cut off from the dollar and the euro and the pound. And I think that is a stark choice that needs to be made far more clear.
And this is a point I think that Jeffrey Sonnenfeld made recently on the channel, which is that whereas Russia may have, a substantial GDP, almost all of that comes from extraction industries. It does not have any value-add industries, manufacturing base. It does not have a big middle class. And in fact, the nascent middle class, many of them have fled the country over the last couple of years in reaction to Putin's increasing authoritarian behavior. So in that respect, there's not much in that for China as well. It's not a huge market for manufactured goods from China either.
Well, China has bought a lot of Russian oil at a discount, and it wants to keep that discounted Russian oil flowing. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that relationship. China, of course, is also buying oil from Iran in huge, volumes relative to Iran's global exports of oil. So I wouldn't, there are interests on both sides here. But at this point, Russia doesn't have another place to sell its oil. If 90% of its oil exports are going to China and India. So it doesn't have much room to maneuver on that front with the EU embargo on place on Russian oil, and the US also refusing to accept Russian oil. The world has shrunk in terms of the marketplace where Russia can sell its hydrocarbons.
You also mentioned, I think, very interestingly, places like Cyprus that have almost become outposts of the sort of Moscow mafia empire, as it were. But Russia has put down roots in many countries to try and create an alternative place for it to squirrel its assets and to keep certain transactions out of the rules-based side of the world economy. Places like Serbia, where there are numerous Russian businesses set up in the last couple of years, Cyprus, UAE, I think you mentioned as well. Is there anything that Europe and the US can do about these sort of intermediary countries that are providing a sort of network for Russian money and assets to flow out of Moscow?
Right. So in the book, I decided to go to two outposts of Russian money. One was Cyprus, which has historically been one of the major routes for Russian money to flow out and into the world. Um, Partly because the US and the UK sanctioned some high-profile enablers, sort of accountants and lawyers that Russian billionaires were using to set up offshore shell companies. And it was quite an extreme step to take. They targeted one very well-known so-called enabler who'd worked with prominent Russians, and that really created a chill in the sort of lawyer accountant community in Cyprus. And I think Europe has leaned on Cyprus quite heavily to shut down a lot of the Russian money flowing through Cyprus. But they had welcomed Russians through a citizenship by investment scheme, whereby Russians could invest and buy a property in Cyprus and get a passport. So I go into that because it was really quite fascinating to explore kind of on the ground what happened to some of those prominent individuals that were managing Russian money. And what it was clear to me is that a lot of the money was going from Cyprus, which was less hospitable now, post 2022 invasion, to the UAE. Because there's been a flood of Russian money in Dubai. And I spent some time in Dubai reporting for the book to try to kind of give a sense of on the ground what it was like. There were mansions, villas on the waterfront that were snapped up by Russian billionaires. The UAE has made it quite clear that they don't follow US sanctions. The only sanctions they follow are UN sanctions. There had been some efforts to kind of crack down on that. A watchdog called FATF had put UAE on its gray list, which signaled that there were concerns about money laundering, and they had worked quite hard to get off that list. And I think they did make it more difficult for Russian money to flow through. They did pass some changes in terms of checks on real estate transactions and the like. But I think that those are two examples of how to handle the issue of Russian money, that there is a real possibility to try to shut this down and make it more difficult, but that you do have countries like UAE and Turkey that it appears to be more or less, an open door for Russian money to come through.
This is a topic perhaps we could spend a couple of hours on just this topic alone, but I want to touch on it from the point of view of sanctions. So you've written also compellingly about the rising oligarchy in the US, of which people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and so on are, potentially advocates for. Now, we're not going to make any claims here directly about Russian money, but certainly Russian influence and Russian narratives can be identified in many things that these two individuals say. And of course, the oligarch in chief himself, Trump, who is running for the position of next president. Of course, we don't know the outcome of that. What we do know, however, is that he has made several statements in relation to sanctions and made it clear that he doesn't understand what they're for, doesn't believe in their impact, and actually doesn't believe in sanctions at all. So how dangerous would it be if a Trump presidency was to seek to normalize relations with Russia and indeed remove much of the primary and secondary sanctions that are currently in place, let alone create any new ones?
Right. So let's be clear. Trump really did, he liked sanctions against Iran. He had no problems with using sanctions as a tool against Iran or even Venezuela. But when it came to Russia, he took exception to that. So it wasn't sanctions as a concept itself. It was specifically sanctions against Russia. You did see the Trump administration roll out a series of sanctions against Russia, but it was under pressure from Congress, congressional legislation mandating and requiring sanctions be rolled out against Russia, as well as his hawkish national security advisors. And I go into that in my book, the period of the Trump administration. And his former national security advisor, John Bolton, told me he was constantly questioning, why do we have to sanction Russia again? We just hit them with a bunch of sanctions. So he was not supportive of the economic penalties on Russia. And if you look at what might happen should he win the presidency again, most of those sanctions that have been rolled out since 2022 have been under a presidential executive order. So he could lift them if he wants to. And the only thing that could stop him would be a veto-proof majority in Congress that would mandate he does not lift them. And so I think that is a danger. Sure, there are plenty of traditional Republicans, particularly in the Senate, who are very hawkish on Russia and are supportive of Ukraine, even if they're supportive of Trump. So, it would be hard to figure out how that might, the chips may fall on that. But I think it is a real risk that in order to get Putin to agree to end the war, which is what he says he wants to do, that he would have to entice Putin with some kind of at least limited sanctions relief to get him to agree to some kind of ceasefire and demilitarization zone, which is what J.D. Vance has outlined.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because when you parse a lot of these sort of narratives, those that are openly, pro-Kremlin or are putting, lines together that may be amenable to the Kremlin, such as J.D. Vance, almost all of them are based on the idea that there is some economic rationality behind Putin's calculus, behind his objectives, that his long-term goals can be structured in some rational way. It seems to me, however, from the conversations had on this channel, that actually it is not about resources. It's not even about territory. It's about directly challenging the international rules-based order, creating an alternative to it, taking apart the post-World War II order, and indeed challenging and undermining democracy itself. It seems that many of those that either want to engage with Russia and some of those that even don't want to engage Russia are trying to impose their own economic rationality on Putin, and these may well not be a good framework for understanding his objectives.
I agree. I don't think that Trump or J.D. Vance really understand what Putin really wants. I think they think, oh, we give him some territory and he'll stop. And I don't think they've appreciated that actually Putin's goals are to take all of Ukraine and not only ensure that Ukraine not join NATO or the EU, but that it has, almost no military to defend itself. And it declares neutrality. And so I think what Putin really wants is some kind of breathing room to regroup and rearm. That even if he does agree to freeze the conflict where it is now, I don't think that means we can trust that he's not going to come back and take another bite at this. I think, we saw that already happen in 2014. And I would suspect he would try again to retake more territory in Ukraine, opportunistically looking at the global situation.
And it seems as well there's something else perhaps we don't quite appreciate, and that is that Putin's training, KGB training, but also his experience in the 1990s suggests to him that everybody has a price. Everybody at some level is corruptible He also seems to believe that the West does not have the stomach and the will to shoulder economic pain in the long term, whereas he can do that. He can impose that upon the Russian people because there's no one to essentially oppose that. Do you think that actually, in both of these regards, there is unfortunately some truth in this, and everything he's seen over the last 3 years actually suggests to him that he didn't get these two foundations of his strategic calculus wrong?
Right. I mean, anyone who knows Russian history knows that the Russian people have shown an ability to withstand the most enormous hardship. And we haven't seen anywhere near a kind of any difficult hardship right now. Yes, ordinary Russians are suffering from high inflation. And there have been reports of economic pain in the pipeline because of interest rates now at 21%. There was just a report the other day. I saw that 200 shopping malls are on the verge of declaring bankruptcy because of the debt burden that they have. So, it's unclear how this will play out. But at the moment, it has caused pain for the Russian elite at the top work because they had their lifestyles disrupted, and they can't flit between the south of France and Moscow like they could. But the pain of the sanctions on the wider Russian population has not been felt because Putin has been showering resources, higher wages at defense factories, massive bonuses for Russian soldiers that sign up to fight on the front line, and huge death benefits to those who have died on the front line in Ukraine. So there's been a lot of money, spread around to keep the peace, so to speak. But how long Putin can keep this going remains to be seen. I think you can't do this forever. You can't keep a hot economy running at high inflation with 21% interest rates for forever. There's a cap to that, a natural cap to that. When will that turning point come? I don't know, but I do think he wants some breathing room.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because again, this is an area which some of the diaspora Russians will focus on, but you don't really seem to get any coverage in parts of the mainstream media. And this is sort of, let's say, the debate or even the sniping between Sergei Chemyazov and Elvira Nabiullina, which seems to be coming out. So on the one hand, you've got this struggle to try and keep a cap on inflation using this, fairly brutish instrument of interest rates. But because of what's called the deficit of cadres, or the lack of people to fulfill certain roles, including in the defense industry, and the ramped inflation for components, materials, and indeed labor, it does suggest that not only the civilian economy, but actually the military machine is going to start feeling significant pain from the failure to rein in inflation, and indeed to have any kind of rational economics when it comes to matching output with the cost of production.
Right. I mean, very good point. What you have is Nabiullina, the central bank chief, who's a technocrat and was, before the full-scale invasion, was a respected monetary policymaker. She knows what she's doing technically, and she has helped Putin tremendously protect the economy from sanctions. I mean, he probably has her to thank for more than anyone else for keeping the economy going. But all this spending on defense in 2025, Russia's due to spend something like $145 billion on defense and security, 6% of GDP. In many respects, Russia is going backwards in time. It's almost going back to a planned economy. And you see that because of the payments problem, it has had to resort to, in some cases, barter. There was this example of a deal between Russia and Pakistan to trade chickpeas for mandarins. This is not economically efficient. So you have Nabiullina, the central bank chief, working at odds with the Russian government and the Kremlin, which is showering money on the defense industry. And in some ways, hiking interest rates isn't having as much of an effect as you might think because there's so much state spending now keeping the economy going. I don't think GDP growth is a great measure of how the Russian economy is doing. There's some degree of military Keynesianism. Big spending will obviously produce economic growth. Whether or not you even believe the economic growth figures, obviously there has been growth because of the huge churning out of weapons and tanks, et cetera. But I think that it's definitely moving Russia backwards rather than forwards, and it's crowding out the civilian economy. In many respects, at this point, Putin needs to keep this war going because economically, um, the entire economy is geared towards keeping this war going. If he stops it, what does he do then? I mean, it'll be very difficult for him to keep the economy buoyant without defense spending.
That's right. And there's other areas of the economy which perhaps don't quite get the same focus either. We've seen stories about the price of butter skyrocketing. There haven't been too many stories about deficits of particular goods. But what is perhaps masking the true rate of inflation is not just the massaging of figures, which you've mentioned, and unfortunately, the repetition of some of those figures by IMF and other groups. But you also have, let's say, in the car market, you have Russians being forced to buy inferior goods, let's say sort of Chinese auto products, and they're paying a huge premium. These things are now more expensive than the previously imported European sort of luxury automobiles. This is a form of rampant inflation, but is somehow masked by the figures. How much do you think this is going on, both on the consumer side, but also on things like machine tools, aero parts, etc.? It's extraordinary masked inflation.
I mean, a lot of attention has been paid to how leaky the sanctions are and how Russia has effectively developed a system of so-called parallel imports, importing goods from Georgia or Latvia or Lithuania or Kazakhstan, whereby, for instance, Audis are being shipped to Georgia and then shipped on to Russia and sold at what my reporting indicated in the book, double the price is what they were going for in the United States. Likewise, iPhones coming into Russia, and they're sold at a premium, and that has fed into inflation. So even if some of these goods that are not supposed to be getting into Russia are getting in, it's not to say that the sanctions aren't working, because it is feeding into inflation. And you can see that across the board. I mean, there has been some degree of a switch to other products. As you mentioned, Chinese cars have really overtaken. And you see examples. Another case I go into the book of this Renault factory producing, instead of Western cars made with Western components, they're just taking Chinese assembly kits and putting them together. And then, of course, selling them at a markup, because it's just an employment scheme, basically, for Mayor Sobyanin to keep the number of factory personnel gainfully employed. So it's extremely economically inefficient. And I think there's only so long it can continue like this.
So there's just two areas to sort of touch on in the time we've got left. One really is briefly not looking at the whole origins of the vehicles that Russia managed to create abroad to launder funds. Now, that of course is very much with cooperation of places like the City of London, giving rise to Londongrad and so on. The question more is, how do we prevent these kind of sort of money laundering locations from popping up again and doing business as usual when Russia is potentially pushed out of Ukraine? But also, that's the sort of that's the sort of hard money laundering. There's also a sort of soft form of money laundering, and that is through academia, think tanks, prizes, grants, cultural projects, so-called soft influence. How do we go about sort of preventing a slide back to the normalization, especially if Putin is still in power?
It's a really good question. It's probably one of the hardest things to fix and address, because you just see the Russian messaging seeping into various debates in Europe and the United States. It's been really quite successful. And Russia, let's face it, is really good at this. And it's been good at it for quite a long time, the so-called active measures to advance Russian propaganda. And what you see the US in particular doing, intelligence agencies trying to expose these networks and declassify intelligence. They just made a warning last night about Russian efforts to undermine faith in the US election by spreading fake videos and articles designed to kind of foment violence in the United States. And so I think the best weapon against that is to try to expose these networks as much as possible so that people are aware of them. But it is insidious. And I think it's going to be just a constant back and forth fight because Russia seems intent on this hybrid warfare model, trying to get its messaging across. And particularly Europe is, I think, the focus of it because they know that Europe is a soft target on this, particularly countries like Germany, where the economic ties between Russia and Germany go back. And you see it working in many respects. Some of the comments that German officials have made, even Olaf Scholz recently, it shows that this Russian messaging exercise has been effective because it comes at a time when there has been a degree of exhaustion with the war in Ukraine and tight budgets in Europe. And I think the level of defense spending is something that is required in Europe and the United States, is something that I don't think people have gotten their heads around, that we are in a new era. This is the end. We had this massive peace dividend and when the end of the Cold War happened, and that's over. We need to start preparing for a new world. And this is a new reality, and we're not going to go back to the way things were before.
I think at the height of the Cold War, for instance, Britain would have been approaching 6.5% GDP on defense. We're now struggling to debate whether to get up to the 2.5% level, which is the sort of minimum requirement. So this clearly a lot more effort is required on that. A few European countries ahead of us on that. Many are not. Yeah, this is going to be a key focus, I think, once the American election out of the way. The last question, and this is maybe the most difficult one of all, which is unless we're able to make Russia pay for the extraordinary criminality it has unleashed on Ukraine, unless some form of punitive sanctions and indeed reparations can be imposed upon Russia, is there any sense in which Ukraine will actually achieve justice, both for the individual crimes, but also for the massive dislocation and destruction of its economy, resources, infrastructure, and so on?
Well, I think it's going to be really hard. I think that you'd have to have a massive change in Moscow before any kind of reparations are agreed. I think there's actually quite an easy solution for at least part of it, which is I go into this in the book and I've tried to make it accessible. The whole freezing of Russia's central bank reserves, this $300 billion pot of Russian sovereign state assets. This is not private assets belonging to oligarchs. This is, belongs to the Russian central bank. There had been efforts to try to seize that entire money and use it for Ukraine. But unfortunately, most of the assets were in Europe, and there was division within the EU over whether or not to go that next step and seize the assets. And I think that was the result of a calculated strategy by Putin. He had moved more of Russia's central bank assets into euros, away from dollars, because he knew that Europe would be too divided to act. But that would at least go some way towards helping Ukraine survive and win this war. What you've seen is this half measure, which is a loan of roughly $50 billion backed by the interest payments on that pot of money, which they have finally agreed. The G7 has finally agreed to do that, which is a great step forward. And it was a great short-term fix for what is really a long-term problem. I do think that they're eventually going to have to use that money. There's no point that, how do you go back to the US Congress and demand more money for Ukraine aid when there's this pot of Russian money sitting there that could be used, that is never going back to Russia? All lawyers agree that Ukraine deserves war reparations. So why not just take the money now? Let's not make the same mistake again. Make the right call, but too late to make a difference. So let's see how that plans out. I unfortunately think there won't be the political will in Europe to go the next step for quite a number of years, but I think it will eventually happen.
Especially given Germany and Scholz is perhaps one of the biggest blockers on doing that. Who knows? I mean, that dynamic may change soon. Germany is due an election and potentially a change of government coming up. So everything to play for. We haven't, of course, talked about the US election because at this point the results are unknown. When the video comes out, we may well have some insights into where that's going and whether the results is going to be challenged or not. But I think on a lot of what we said here, the results of the US election are going to be fairly decisive in terms of how these issues play out moving forward. In that case, it'd be great to speak to you maybe in a couple of weeks, couple of months' time to see how these issues are playing out following, let's say a transition in the US government. For today, Stephanie, it's a huge pleasure speaking to you. Your book is massively recommended to the audience. So we'll put links to that in the description, and I can't sort of recommend that highly enough to people who want to understand how this global war is going to be playing out, especially on the financial front.
Thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.